politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018 day. My name is Nick Pitts, and this is the Millennial Roundtable for Point of View. And I am so glad that you decided to tune in, because we have got a packed show for you. During the first hour, we'll have open lines as we talk about everything from whose button is bigger with North Korea to identity politics to transparency to fake news. We're going to cover it all, and so be sure to tune in is on the Facebook page, or you can call in. We'd love to hear your comments or calls as well, and that number is 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. And because it's the Millennial Roundtable, of course, we're going to tell you to tune in to the Facebook page, facebook.com/pointofviewradio, where you can find us. And fortunately, you'll be able to see Chelsey. Unfortunately, you'll have to see me as well for some of the time. So nevertheless, you can tune in, and we'll be taking questions, comments as well from the Facebook page as well. So be sure to go on there, like it, and leave a comment, and we'll be sure to engage with you as the show continues to go on. So joining me at the Millennial Roundtable today, we have the one and only Kerby Anderson. Kerby, so good to see you again.
Always good to see you, and it's good to have both of you back from your Christmas vacations.
It is so good.
We got to hear about yours, but we haven't heard about this one yet.
I know. The land of the potatoes. So tell us, Chelsey Youman of First Liberty Institute is here as well, journeyed back from Idaho, right?
Yes, I was in southern Idaho, the land of potatoes and mountains and snow.
Yeah.
So, although I haven't thought out much since I got back, because Dallas, Texas is cold right now.
It's cold
with
everywhere.
the rest of the country.
It is cold everywhere right now, but nevertheless, it is warm in the White House right now as President Trump is tweeting fire. And so we will jump right into it. We're going to be taking your calls and comments as well, so be sure to listen in, and we'd love to hear from you. So President Trump to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, my button is bigger than yours. Yesterday at 6:49 p.m. Eastern time. Unfortunately, this is just not a joke.
It's a day that will live in infamy.
A day that will live in infamy. Where I think our president tweeted about 14 times yesterday. He says, quote, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I, too, have a nuclear button, but it's much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works. And at current day, we've got 159,000 retweets, Kerby. So there are a number of individuals that support, or at least want to accentuate the fact that our president has a bigger, better button that actually works.
I've heard people in high school use those kind of phrases, but I don't think I've heard a president in recent memory use that. So this is a little bit of uncharted territory. Let me start with the obvious. I think Kim Jong-un is unstable, as probably as easily an argument you could make on that alone. So you don't necessarily want to say these kind of provocative things to someone who already isn't necessarily rational. So, again, I understand that we sort of love a little bit of that push, that bravado. But, Chelsey, I don't know. This just doesn't sound like the best thing to say to Kim Jong-un right now.
You know, I have to confess that when I read Trump's tweets, I read them in Regina George's voice from Mean Girls. She's a character on a movie called Mean Girls, because this is like a high school drama that we get to read. Then I get sad because it turns out it's our president. So they have both gone back and forth. They've shared barbs with each other, calling each other old and fat and short at times. So truly, I think this is a banter they have going on. I don't think there's much, depth to come from this. Our armies have not changed, or military bases. The amount of men we have stationed in Japan or in South Korea have not changed. Our naval bases have not moved. So really, I think it's more words at this point than anything else.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the comments that one of the Pittsburgh commentators, Selena Zelino, she said during the campaign. She said that there are a contingent of Trump supporters that always take him seriously but never take him literally. And then there are Trump antagonizers and those opponents that would say that they always take him literally but not necessarily seriously. And so I think this really does illuminate, I guess, that divide, what we're continuing to see, Kerby. I mean, there's one side, as I was reading through and I was watching the news, there's one side that really did see this as very alarmist, that our president would be threatening nuclear war. President that's a conservative, president that's, innocent lives are lost in nuclear war. And so they took great alarm in this, and the fact that our president could be giving provocations to launch a nuclear weapon onto a country of 27 million people. But then there's the other side that just laughed this off as lighthearted, like, well, this is just him continuing to play into that bravado that historically what we've continued to see. And so we really see this pretty significant chasm of people that are alarmed by this type of behavior, as well as people that are just laughing this off as, oh, President Trump is just being President Trump.
And the policy implication is very simple. There are Democratic leaders right now that say that they want to pass a resolution that would prevent the president from actually being involved in a preemptive nuclear war. I don't think that's even a possibility. But again, you've got to recognize we've just moved into the 2018 election season, so they're going to use that and anything else that can be said. But let's also remind ourselves we do have an adult in the room. Her name is Nikki Haley. She may be the next president in 2020, for all I know. And she certainly has made it much clearer to the international community that we cannot allow North Korea to actually be engaged in the kind of activities that they are engaged in. So we'll see what happens at this point and whether or not we can bring China along, because if not, we're just going to keep having this war of words, and let's hope it's only a war of words and nothing else.
Yeah, Chelsey, that was an illuminating point that Kerby made about the idea of Nikki Haley. So our UN ambassador, she came in later on during the comments, and when she was addressing a press conference, she said that the United States will not allow for a nuclear North Korean state. And so it does give us, outside of the tweet, it does kind of give us a policy framework by which to understand how we're going to engage with North Korea, which seems to be tenable and right and true.
Right. In spite of all the Twitter back and forth, there is actually a foreign policy and a Department of State in charge and Congress in charge. So there are a lot of moving pieces here to consider. One being that this week, North Korea actually, in a rare step of what I would call diplomacy, extended an offer to South Korea, who is hosting the Winter Olympics, to begin diplomatic talks and discussions, which is a step forward. And in response to that, we talked about our UN diplomat and her response being, we still, even if they do come forward, we still have parameters as a country. We have strong interest in not allowing North Korea or Iran and many other countries to become nuclear powers. But we have to also look at Kim Jong-un, and it truly is in his interest. He's determined because he thinks nuclear, he believes that it raises his capital and his power to have nuclear. So we are just truly at odds on this interest. The question, I think, is going to come down to China. China historically has strongly backed North Korea. They're still an ally. However, they've distanced themselves diplomatically as of late, I would say in the last 5 years or so. And they also have a vested interest in not having the United States and South Korea stationed in South Korea, in Japan making moves in the region. They have an interest in regional stability.
Yeah, it brings up a great New Yorker article that we'll talk about once we get back from the break. The idea that America is moving out of a position of leadership relative to the world, especially with the emphasis upon America first, and China appears to be making overtures in order to establish global dominance as well as a leadership position. We'd love to hear from you, though, so you can be sure to call in at 800-351-1212 or go over to the Facebook page, facebook.com/pointofviewradio, where you can kind of leave your comment or your question, and we'll get to that. And so when we come back, we're going to continue to look at the bigger picture in North Korea and what should be the next steps and how can we be thinking about that. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when President Trump set forth his national security strategy, he omitted global climate change as a threat. 2 years earlier, President Obama elevated climate change as a top strategic risk in his strategy. The ongoing debate about the significance of climate change will continue for years to come. I contend that the debate is really about percentages. Consider people who often are labeled climate change deniers. Even these people believe the climate changed in the past. We've had an ice age and a medieval warming period. They just don't believe that human activity is the major driver for climate change. But they will usually admit that some small percentage of human activity might be influential. On the other side are people who are deeply concerned about climate change, but I doubt any of them believe that human activity is responsible for 100% of the change in the climate. We've had variations in the climate long before the Industrial Revolution, so really the debate is between percentages. Some believe the percentage is low, others believe it is higher. Sometimes the discussion is framed as a debate between those who believe in science, that is climate change, and others who are anti-science, the deniers. But consider this recent quote from geologist Ian Plimer, who believes in evolution and is anything but an anti-science proponent. He says climate change has taken place for thousands of millions of years. Climate change occurred before humans evolved on Earth. He says he cannot find any correlation between temperature change and human emissions of carbon dioxide. Therefore, he concludes that without correlation, there is no causation. Perhaps it is time to cool some of the rhetoric and consider what we know and don't know about climate change. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back on Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, leading up our Millennial Roundtable here on Point of View on Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Chelsey Youman of the First Liberty Institute, an astute legal mind, I might add, and then Kerby Anderson, the knower of all things, really. He's just one of the great generalists of our world today, and so grateful for him. And we have been talking about whose button is bigger, right? So President Trump tweeted yesterday, kind of pushing and challenging Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, relative to kind of the nuclear button that each individual has. This originally started, I guess, when you could say Rocket Man over the weekend talked about how he has a nuclear button that's not a threat, but it's just reality, is what he said in one of his addresses over the weekend, and then said that it is always at his desk. Well, President Trump yesterday, in one of his many tweets, double-digit tweets, I believe it was around 14, said that that Kim Jong-un, that he has a bigger button, a better button, and it works. And so this really does highlight, though, a bigger picture, because we know about the threat of North Korea. We know about the significance of them. They've continued for the past year to be able to demonstrate that they are moving towards more of being a nuclear viable state. But it does, if we look at the bigger context picture, an interesting article out of the New Yorker this past weekend really highlighted the fact that this America First mantra of President Trump has really decided that it's going to take a step back from the global scheme of things in order that they can take care of our own business, right? And then you've also got China that really is making overtures to establish more of a leadership position within the world. And then, Chelsey, you brought up a very illuminating point that China is really the key in this region right now, because they are, to a certain degree, largely sustaining what's happening in North Korea right now. So it really does have us question, what is the role of America in this conflict, one, and does it have a role? Because it appears as though we're taking steps back on the one hand, but then these tweets are indicating something else, it seems like.
Well, I think the real question, because I do think we will have a role. We have strong allies in the region, both in South Korea and in Japan. I think the real question is, what will it take for us to get more actively involved in a military sense? And I don't see the U.S. taking a preemptive action against North Korea unless there is a really viable threat. And so I think that Trump, as he has in his entire administration, defers to the experts in the room. And he has done a really great job of I'm sure he'll do the same in this sense with military experts and really checking them and having them make some really strong military decisions based on what's going to be best for the U.S. And that is one thing for all of the rhetoric we can be sure of, is that Trump will do what he feels is best for the United States.
So, Kerby, that brings up a really great point that I think you illuminated earlier. So is Trump feeding the fire that is a threat with the rhetoric that he's offering right now, right? Because we talk about Kim Jong-un, and I think we can all agree that he is unstable. We just cannot predict his behavior. And so by the tweets that are going out overseas and that are landing upon his countenance, what we take as a joke, he could take as a threat, right? And so is Trump indirectly feeding that fire right now?
Well, again, you hope that General Mattis says, that's probably not a good idea, Mr. President, because we've got enough issues here. We know what even a conventional conflict with North Korea would look like. A nuclear exchange would be greater. Gets back to, in a sense, what Chelsey just brought up a minute ago. What is our best interest and what is China's best interest? China has been cheating on what's supposed to be some kinds of blockades and moratoriums. We understand that. But at the same time, they're not benefiting very much from being a supporter of North Korea. And they also recognize that even though the focus right now in North Korea is on the United States, someday the focus could be on China. Now, can one nuclear weapon actually do a great deal of damage? Yes. But it can do a whole lot more if it does not explode on land, but if it explodes in the air, because that creates what's called an electromagnetic pulse. And this is the greater concern that has been expressed by at least some people in the State Department and in the Pentagon, that if you were to actually get a missile and a rocket, and right now North Korea hasn't done real well with some of those rockets, which explode on the launch pad and everything else. But if you could get one to launch over North America, especially over maybe Kansas, and explode it then, it would send a pulse. It wouldn't kill people. It would kill electronics. But eventually it would kill lots of people, because just think of everything that we depend on right now in terms of our electronics, and that would be everything from heating and cooling. It would be everything from our electrical grid. It would be almost every, at least modern car. Maybe you could find some 1950s cars that would work, and it would just be an absolute disaster. Well, that same missile can be exploded over China, and it could just wipe out Beijing or Shanghai or something of that. So this is where I think, even if you can't depend on Donald Trump, let's depend on Nikki Haley. I'll come back to one of the people everybody seems to like right now, to convince those in China, in South Korea, Japan, maybe even Russia, that you have got to do all you can to marginalize North Korea and perhaps even help us see if we can demilitarize this country, because it's in your best interest as well as in our best interest to not have a nuclear North Korea.
I mean, you think about it, Chelsey, just the sheer significance of the players that are involved in this particular action right now, right? So you've got the United States, which is the largest GDP in the entire world. You've got China, which is number 2. You've got Japan, which is number 4. I mean, those are 3 out of the top 5 GDPs. And so we're experiencing a market boom right now. And I think that really does illuminate one of the Eurasia, which is a geopolitical firm that I highlighted today in the daily briefing. Eurasia says that this year, out of the 20 years that they've been in existence, this year is when they're expecting a very unexpected disaster to happen. And they're noticing that just the individuals, that though the market is booming, the lack of governing that's happening by the governments right now. So there's significance to be had, especially in this volatile region, that I think it's going to be important, like you said earlier, to be able for the U.S. to exercise some form of leadership, right?
Absolutely. And, I keep coming back to this, but I do think that when you're talking diplomacy and international relations, you really have to understand your enemy's interests, their goals. And one of those primary goals is for Kim Jong-un to protect his own authority and power, which means protect his own regime. And the question is going to come down to is how realistic is he about losing a battle with the U.S. because if he has a realistic mindset on that, and if he understands really what's at play, then he's all talk in the region. And it's on us to have foreign entities and allies or even non-allies to apply the pressure to help them demilitarize.
I think that was one of the probably, I guess you could say, encouraging things, Kerby, that broke even just this morning about how North Korea has opened up the communication line that had been closed for the past 2 years with South Korea. So maybe it's not the U.S. direct involvement, but it appears as though, again, appearances can be deceiving, but it appears as though North Korea is making overtures to be able to try to build some type of relationship or restore some type of relationship with South Korea, especially considering that the world is about to convene there for the 2018 Winter Olympics.
Well, again, we have to figure out, is this a diplomatic head fake or feint, or is there something serious to that? And again, if North Korea has any sanity there, maybe not necessarily resident in the mind of Kim Jong-un, but somewhere, to recognize that the attention of the world will be on South Korea. Now, there's a lot of question about this Winter Olympics because so many people have been getting hypothermia because it's so cold there. So would they postpone that in light of tensions, in light of weather, use the weather as an excuse, or will that begin to thaw, if I can keep the metaphor going, the diplomatic relationships between the two? But at the same time, just before we take a break, let me just say one other thing. I know this gets complicated, but it's important to recognize that what's at stake is not just North Korea and the United States. What's at stake also is Iran. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about Iran and the unrest that is there, and also talked about more people become Christians in the last 20 years than the previous 13 centuries before. So there's a lot of unrest in Iran, but at the same time, Iran is saying we would like a nuclear weapon because we can see the tremendous power that North Korea has. So how we deal with North Korea has implications even in places like Iran, which right now is in the midst of a great deal of turmoil.
Well, it's fascinating what's happening right now. What we're continuing to see is that President Trump has decided that he's going to adopt an American first mentality, and that really is giving an emphasis on America, but it appears as though the world is on fire right now, and it really does require an American presence. And there's good news to be had. President Trump has spoken very boldly relative to kind of some of the Iran protesters, as you illuminated yesterday. Really is encouraging them to be the people to rise up and kind of not necessarily overthrow this regime, but at least be able to signify that we're tired of being your ploys in the midst of this. And so we would love to hear from you. And so we want to remind you that you can call in to the show at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. And you can also jump on over to the Facebook page, facebook.com/pointofviewradio, where you can unfortunately see me, but fortunately have the opportunity to be able to like as well as share a comment or a question that we might be able to answer. We're going to take one of those commercial breaks, but when we come back, we'll continue to talk about this, but also the prevalence of fake news and what's happening. There was a recent study that was put out by Dartmouth University and with a couple of other universities that indicated that the prevalence of fake news, not only in 2016, but the implications into 2017, can be somewhat a little bit troubling. And so we're going to explore that when we get back right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back on Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, and this is the Millennial Roundtable of Point of View. So no selfies have been taken, no Snapchats have, as far as I can tell. Chelsey might be another. You never know with Chelsey.
I'm a sneaky snapper.
Yeah, she might be a sneaky snapper, but nevertheless, no sneaky snappers, I guess. So this is the Millennial Roundtable for Point of View on this Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018 day. And we have been talking about all things North Korea right now and just some of the general unrest, but I guess just some of the positive notes too, because it can be very difficult just to be able to think about just the magnanimity of the situation right now, especially with the nuclear weapons and just this idea where it just seems like the rhetoric is just increasingly escalating, but there is some good news as well. But speaking of good news, we're also talking about some fake news, Kerby.
Yes.
Fake news. And so I didn't throw up my hashtag, but there was an interesting article that came out yesterday that was a study out of Dartmouth University relative to fake news. And this has been a moniker that we continually hear over and over again, Kerby. And so it was just very fascinating to hear this study that was happening.
You know, first of all, I heard that there was at least one organization, I think it was a university, said that there were certain words they wanted to eliminate from the English language.
Oh, yeah.
And one of those was fake news, you know. And yet we can't eliminate it. Yesterday we talked about this piece on the history of fake news, went all the way back to George Washington, and especially John Adams, who had the Alien and Sedition Act and actually punished people if they did something that was malicious or fake news back then. So we talked a little bit about the history. Today we're talking about it. Tomorrow I've got a piece that's coming out as well on this. And this one has to do with the fact that Trump supporters, apparently, if we take this study seriously, I'm not so sure about this.
Yeah.
But anyway, read more fake news. So maybe in some respects because they don't trust the mainstream media, or they've been told by Donald Trump not to trust the mainstream media, they go to alternative sources. And a lot of those alternative sources aren't necessarily vetted.
Yeah, so I went ahead and read the study. I didn't read the article. I read the study because I was very interested in this, Chelsey. And so, because I think there's a difference to be made between fake news and biased news. I think we're living and moving in a world that's probably more biased than it is fake news. And biased news isn't necessarily fake news, but fake news is traditionally biased news. That biased news is going to be this article is going to be framed in such a way that it favorably views one side and disfavorably views another side. Well, their understanding of fake news, and I think I agree with this particular definition that they used. I think it was based out of Stanford. Fake news is verifiably false information that's used to make another party look advantageous. So that kind of seems as though that seems right. But out of this study, it said that researchers analyzed browsing histories of thousands of Americans in the final weeks of the 2016 U.S. election and found that while the reach of fake news was wide, its influence was limited. This was out of Dartmouth, Princeton, and they found that 1 in 4 Americans visited a fake news website in the weeks before and after the election. The study notes that the consumption of fake news was heavily connected among a small group. Almost 6 in 10 visits to fake news websites came from just 10% of Americans, and those were deeply pro-Trump, is what they found. And so what they're continuing to see, and again, it does make sense to a certain degree because largely, even just the Republican side has traditionally been kind of marginalized by the media. And so what we saw, and what the study appears to show, Kerby, is that individuals that were backing Trump or deeply Trump, according to their language, were moving and gravitating towards these fake news sites.
Well, and again, sometimes they're looking for an alternative source, and you have to be really careful about that. Now, the problem I have with some of these studies is that sometimes they'll call things fake news that are not. Let me use Chelsey as a good example. If I were to tell a lot of people in the mainstream press that there was a suggestion that this cross in Maryland could actually be resolved by cutting off both sides of the cross, they would say that's fake news. That's true, isn't it? If they were to hear that indeed there was a woman that was told by the police that she could not pray in her own home, they would say that's fake news, but that one's true as well.
Right.
So there's just a couple of good examples of First Liberty cases where you got to be believing it was fake news, and it turns out that was really true.
Right. I had 2 initial responses to this. The first is really simple. It's that they proved no causation. So they did not actually prove that this actually influenced the election, that it had any bearing on the election results. So we have no clue really what fake news, the implications of that would be, other than that we know the majority of the consumers of fake news were conservative and were pro-Trump. Just so happened to be. But I also thought it was interesting that they said that the visits were to fake news websites were highest among people who consume the most news. And so these are people who are news junkies, and they're hearing very, very biased anti-Trump news on one side. So perhaps this just provided a balancing effect as opposed to, a motivating effect or a mind-changing, vote-changing effect on the readers.
But I think we can all agree, Kerby, and I think you've probably highlighted this and you'll be highlighting this, is that fake news is just not good news. Yes. It's just, especially for those people that are good news people, fake news is just not really good news because it illuminates something even more than that, is the distrust that we have towards institutions and individuals as well. And when we can't share facts with one another and there's an inherent distrust, it's really hard to move together to create a more prosperous nation.
And that's, again, back to one of the things that we have even in our latest booklet on the politicized culture. I mean, you have people that only watch MSNBC and CNN and maybe read the New York Times. If they do any of that, they go to very liberal websites, Mother Jones. Got others that watch Fox News and maybe listen to Focus on the Family and a variety of other stories. And they don't ever even interact with one another. And so then you have this bias that is built up that I will believe things that reinforce my bias, and I don't look at other facts. So back to Chelsey's comment, one of the ways to make sure that you don't fall prey to fake news is to actually look around a little bit. And it's quite possible that in some of these individuals, I mean, if you were to look at my list of various websites you'd go to, you might find that maybe occasionally I landed on a fake news story, said, is that really true? And I go over, oh, no, it's not. And so we never reported here on Point of View. So that's probably the best antidote to this, is to read widely and to not deal with what I call confirmation bias, where you just only read the things and listen to the things that you believe in and discount any others. I've seen people on both sides of the political spectrum guilty of that, and I think it's about time that we just read more widely and begin to ask really important questions.
That's so true. And to remember, too, that conservatives were probably already going to vote for Trump. So, at some point, the window that this study did actually look at was post-primary. And so just making sure everyone does their due diligence as best as they can to find neutral, authentic websites.
And I completely agree. And again, this isn't new, right? So one of the things I'm always wanting to go back to is what Mark Twain says, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And Kerby, as you illuminated, we can look back throughout history and we can see, quote unquote, there was fake news. It's just a more palatable way to say people lied. People were lying back in George Washington's day because you had Thomas Jefferson that was employing Philip Freneau at the Gazette of the United States. You had individuals on Alexander Hamilton's side of the Federalists that were employing individuals for the National Gazette that were lying. I'm reading Robert Mary's President McKinley book, and the fact that McKinley McKinley was moving towards some of this, what we would consider fake news today. And it's for a shocking twist, we've survived to it, Kerby.
Well, and again, let's come back to First Liberty, and that is, if you think about it, and we mentioned this yesterday, the people that were really pushing for the First Amendment were people like Benjamin Franklin, newspaper pamphleteer, Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams. You go down, these were individuals that had seen what happens when the government told you what you could or could not print. And that's why they pushed 3 years after the ratification of the Constitution to have the Bill of Rights. And the first one is the freedom of course, religion, the freedom of press, the freedom of assembly, and the right to petition your government. And so the First Amendment, I think, is still the best way to go. And when government says, no, we need to step in, or even Facebook says we need to step in and try to figure out what is or isn't true, let's just allow a lot of different flowers to bloom and have those of us out there pick the right ones and leave the others in the ground.
I completely agree.
It'll be interesting to see, I think, how the media or journalism as a whole responds to as much criticism, all of the criticism that they have been under for the last year or so. I think that trust in the media is at an all-time low right now. The head of New York Times just stepped down and had a really fabulous quote, frankly, about the climate in journalism right now. And they can really rise to the occasion. I mean, they have the opportunity here to say, we're going to have authentic reporting, fact-checking, real witnesses and statements. I mean, they have the opportunity here to really redeem their reputation.
Yeah, and I think even more, especially in the 21st century, or I'll just say in 2018 rather, there's going to be the important delineation between the media and between journalism. Just because there used to be a day that we could just associate the two, but now with the rise of less gatekeepers and the more ability to be able to access information and get out your information, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're a part of the media that you have the journalistic chops to be able to find the truth and be able to propagate the facts. We'd love to hear from you, and so you can tune into Facebook. Go to facebook.com/pointofviewradio and leave a comment or leave a question, and we'll be sure to get to that during our time on air, or you can call in 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. We'll be taking your calls and comments as we get on later on in the show, and we would love to hear from you during that. Or you can make your way over to the website, pointofview.net, where you can find some of the articles that we'll be mentioning for the rest of the show. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Ben Franklin reportedly said, "There is nothing certain in life except for death and taxes." Well, in a 548-page complaint, one man has targeted at least one of those certainties, and it's not death. Terry Lee Hines contends that the United States tax code has violated the Constitution by establishing taxism and institutionalized faith and religion. Because the tax code has the effect of favoring and even promoting organized religions through tax breaks and other benefits, Mr. Hines believes the tax code is in violation of the First Amendment. Well, I suppose this is the sort of case that law students are forced to grapple with, but actually have little effect in the real world. Some may dream that such a lawsuit is the silver bullet to bring down our ghoulish tax system. Alas, Mr. Hines' lawsuit will not free us from the taxman's visit every April 15. For one reason, taxpayers have a lot of hurdles to overcome just to bring the lawsuit. Mere allegations, even ones dressed up in the garb of a First Amendment challenge, that they do not like to pay taxes will not be sufficient. For now, Mr. Hines and the rest of us will have to continue to pay our taxes, and most importantly, the religious charities and houses of worship that are exempt from them will continue to be exempt. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back on Point of View on this Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018 day. My name is Nick Pitts, and I am joined at the Millennial Roundtable today by Kerby, Anderson, and Chelsey Youman of the First Liberty Institute. And we've been talking about fake news and the prevalence of fake news and just the effect of fake news, or what we don't know about the effect of fake news. But this is some real news that's happened.
This is some real exciting news.
This is real news that happened. First Liberty Institute, protecting First Amendment rights. Chelsey, tell us the real news.
The real news is that FEMA, in the words of Donald Trump, had a tremendous policy change yesterday. Huge policy change yesterday. That is ends 18 years of religious discrimination by the department. I mean, through all the administrations since Clinton, FEMA has refused to give certain types of religious nonprofits any aid because they are more than 50% religious, whatever that means. There's a balancing test there. So they've refused to give aid to houses of worship of all faiths, all churches, religious schools, and religious nonprofits on the same basis that they give aid to their non-religious partners. Well, First Liberty Institute sent a letter. There was a lawsuit, but we sent a letter because there's a really easy regulatory change. This is a policy on the books that can be changed by all the bureaucracy at FEMA. And they did that yesterday. They rendered the changes. Every single change that we asked for in our letter, they changed in the policy. So we're really, really grateful for this turnaround. It's a win for all of the churches in the wake of Hurricanes Irma and Harvey, and even in Puerto Rico. They will all be eligible now to receive FEMA relief.
That's phenomenal. And the timing of this couldn't be better, right? It says we're experiencing these bomb cyclones, or whatever they're called, these ice storms that we're experiencing right now. What we continue to see, if the past is any indication, like what Shakespeare quipped, if the past is prologue, churches have been some of the first institutions to really help out and be the helping hand to some of these individuals. And so this really does not only allow them to be able to do that, but shows that the government is willing to help them.
Yes. You know, I did a commentary back in September, and one of the lines that I borrowed from one of the individuals was to say that Hurricane Harvey didn't cherry pick its victims, so FEMA shouldn't cherry pick who it helps. And you would think, Chelsey, that in light of the Trinity Lutheran Church case out of Missouri, and many of our people remember that, in which it was a church that applied to receive recycled rubber for their playground, that originally the argument was, well, because it's religious, we can't protect the children. And here's the same kind of argument. Because it's religious, we can't protect the churches. You mean the same churches that opened their doors when individuals were flooded out of their homes, the same churches and Christian organizations that oftentimes were there before FEMA to provide some of the goods and services.
Right. And FEMA itself, they have a great faith-based outreach agency internally even. So they're willing to partner with religious entities, and they recognize that religious entities oftentimes are first responders on the scene. They're, as you mentioned, the first to open their doors. I know one of our churches gutted 600 houses in the first week, in spite of the fact they had to gut their own house of worship. And so these are churches that are fundamental to serving their communities. And it's so wonderful now that they're going to be on an equal playing field as their non-religious neighbors.
And it really is. It's just a beneficial thing, especially for the people of God. There's so much hostility, or I don't want to say so much hostility. There can be hostility towards Christians here in the American kind of landscape, right? And when the truths of Christ are really hard to be able to communicate because individuals possibly just don't want to hear that, it really does open an opportunity for the receptivity of Christian acts to be shown. And this is really a positive benefit for Christians, I would think.
I would think so, too. And, Chelsey, this seems to me to be where we're on a roll. We've talked about a couple of lost cases, and, of course, we talked the other day about Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon. We'll probably do that again Friday when Kelly Shackelford is in here. But I don't want people to occasionally hear a defeat in a lower court to not see that, as I mentioned a minute ago, a 7-2 case out of Trinity Lutheran Church in Missouri, this change for FEMA policy. Hopefully we'll have a good decision that comes down on Jack Phillips and the case on Masterpiece Bakery. Of all the reasons to support some of these particular groups like First Liberty and Alliance Defending Freedom and a variety of other groups is because they are really winning these cases and really reestablishing the rights of individuals for their religious convictions, and also not having the government discriminate against somebody simply on the basis of religion.
That's right. You know, I say often at speaking events, because I'll talk a lot about our cases, and to be frank, it's very depressing to look at a lot of the rights that people appear to be losing, or at least be challenged. And I say we are winning. Our rights are strong. We have over 225 years of religious liberty protections on the books. But those rights are often tested, and it just takes people sometimes coming forward, like the Trump administration, who's actually been very keen on religious liberty rights and very in touch with the evangelical community or religious community at large. Let's not forget, I think there are 24 mosques that lost their mosques out of Houston. So people of all faith really need the support, and he really came out strong, showing that he was willing to give that and ended 18 years of religious discrimination.
That's phenomenal. So we're going to take one of the phone calls right now, so you can be sure to call in at 800-351-1212. But we're going to jump over to South Carolina right now. We have Emily on the line. Emily, are you there?
Yes, I am. I really didn't have to be on the air, but I'm just wondering why people don't reiterate the freedom of speech is the right number one, but is not give them the right to actions. And I'm thinking all the time, of course, they have a right to protest, but these like the football player that knelt down that started all this, that was actions. He did not have the right to do that, I don't think. And I've even written the White House, and I called the White House and left that message, but it doesn't seem to go through either. But that's all I have to say. I do listen to your program all the time. I listen to Point of View. I listen to Good News Network. And I wish I knew my call letters, but I don't. But it's 91.7. But anyhow, I don't know why they can do all this that's showing actions instead of speaking, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Emily, you make a really great point, the delineation between the freedom of speech and the freedom of action. I'd love, from the legal standpoint, I know I've watched a couple of Law & Order SVUs, but I unfortunately that's not enough to be able to offer an intelligible comment, so I will yield to the district.
Well, sure. I think, that is a great question. I'm so glad she called in and asked it, because the truth is that speech has been defined by the Supreme Court to be very, very broad. In fact, the Supreme Court right now is the most pro-free speech court, maybe in history. So the jurisprudence behind free speech includes the right to vote, the right to act in accordance with your beliefs. Well, that's at least the free exercise of religion. And then the right to associate with others, which is an action. You don't have to salute the flag, which is an action. You can burn the flag, which is protected speech. So really speech it's anything that conveys a message or a belief or a thought to someone else. And in the case of the bakers out of Oregon, we argue that is expression. They're baking an artistic expression counts as speech. So really speech is a very, very broad category that does extend to action.
That is great. And so when we come back, we're going to take one of the longer break. And then when we come back after the break, we're going to have Gregory Knopf on, and he'll be talking a little bit to explore kind of depression, just because we know that seasonal affective disorder is just something that very much deals with a lot of us. And so he's got some really interesting takes, especially from an article that he just put out, Kerby.
Well, and again, he's been on the program with us before, and also it relates back to kind of the millennial issue, because you've had this book and the TV program 13 Reasons, and some have wondered whether or not that sparked a suicide contagion. Suicide as a rate is increased every single year over the last 2 decades. And about 6% of the American population will experience major depression within the next 12 months. And, of course, about 120 million people worldwide are dealing with depression. So we thought it would be appropriate to talk about that. So there's some obvious connections to all of us, but also some things that we notice with the younger generation that we need to pay attention to as well.
Yeah, I think about it, especially Dear Evan Hansen deals with this issue, and that's on Broadway right now. And then Everybody, Logic, who's one of the rappers, actually has a song where he says, it's called 1-800-273-8255. which is the suicide hotline. And so we're going to be talking about suicide and depression when we come back right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, and this is Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018 edition of Point of View, which is the Millennial Roundtable. And so I am joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson and Chelsey Youman of the First Liberty Institute. And during the first hour, if you were with us, we talked about everything from North Korea to fake news, the provocations in North Korea, the back and forth and escalating tension relative to some of the tweets that have been sent, but also some of the overtures and moves that have been made with North Korea and the U.S. and China and Japan. We talked about and discussed a little bit during that time, but we also talked about fake news, the prevalence of it, the effects that it might have. And we're going to transition during this second hour because we have online with us Dr. Greg Knopf. Greg, are you there?
I am.
Oh, so good. It's so good to have you join us, Greg. Thanks so much for having us.
You guys.
Well, Greg was chosen as one of Portland Monthly Magazine's top doctors and nurses in 2013. He was featured on Focus the Family radio broadcast in March 2012, and also is the author of Demystifying Depression, Medical Insights for Hope and Healing, and also the co-author of Light on the Fringe, Finding Hope in the Darkness of Depression. Greg, this kind of season has been characterized by joy. It's the most wonderful time of year that we sing, but we also know that there's a flip side to this season as well, this seasonal affective disorder and just kind of the holiday post-depression that comes from it. Is this something that's still resonating? Is this still something that's prevalent within the American culture?
I believe it is. It's very common. In fact, I have several patients that I see, and it usually can start not necessarily always after the holidays, but sometimes beforehand, and a lot of people have, dread as they anticipate what the holidays might bode for them. So I have many people who need to be on some medication to help them sort of stabilize their physical and emotional lives. And then usually when the summer comes around, May, June, they can sort of get off the medication. But oftentimes there's a sort of a letdown after the holidays, and the build-up and a lot of expectations and maybe some disappointments that people experience, and says, well, gosh, it really wasn't, what I'd hoped for, and I wonder if it was my fault. And there's a lot of second-guessing that sometimes people will go through, and sometimes just are exhausted, and we oftentimes experience a vulnerability to mood problems when we're just physically tired and we've been staying up late, watching the New Year celebration and being with family and friends. So there's oftentimes a letdown right after the holidays, and we also know the statistics are such that usually the rates of suicide are highest in February and March, which is sort of during the end of the winter time before spring. So those are all factors that are important to keep in mind as people go through this time of year.
Greg, this is Kerby, and one of the things we wanted to talk about in addition to depression is suicide, because this is the Millennial Roundtable. And one of the things we've noticed is that the suicide rate has been increasing every year for the last 2 decades, but it also seems to be increasing a little bit faster with the younger generation. And you and I have talked off air, but we've never really mentioned before that you've had this book, 13 Reasons. You have the TV show. Recently, there was an article in The Atlantic, Did 13 Reasons Why Spark a Suicide Contagion? and it seemed to indicate that the internet surges and searches for suicide skyrocketed after this program that a lot of teenagers and young adults are watching.
You're absolutely right, Kerby. I think that it has created this idea of sort of, I am so alone, I am been so wounded that my only recourse is to get back at you, and the greatest revenge that I can roll over to you and to put onto you as if I were to commit suicide, and then I hope that you live the rest of your life with regret as to what you did to me, and blaming others for the pain in your life. And so there was just several surveys here just done recently in Oregon, and the number of people who are, in fact, attempted suicide is kind of shocking. 9% of 8th graders and 7% of 11th graders have actually attempted suicide in the public school system in Oregon. And more than 40% of students in both grades did not meet the state's benchmark for coping ability. So there's really a crisis going on in our schools and our culture, and it's interesting as to what some of the experts and physicians are trying to say about, well, what are the causes of that. And it's interesting that the three things that they mention are terrorism, cell phones, and increased with the internet and Facebook and comparisons and bullying and those kind of things that can happen with cell phone use. And then the increased economic security, and people are still sort of pulling out of the last recession, and there's, almost half the public school children in Oregon are receiving, assistance for a meal assistance. So those are some of the factors that, the people in control of the state government and the physicians in the health department are sort of surmising. And it's interesting that it's not there's not the sense of is something else going on deeper in our culture as far as our loss of purpose and meaning in life, and how that could be addressed.
No, Greg, that's fascinating, because I look at those three identifiers that you pointed out: terrorism, cell phones, and then social media. And one of those doesn't seem to belong. It seems like terrorism is really just this very starkly different than social media and cell phones.
I agree with you. It's but that's I think they're trying to, whether or not it doesn't say whether the survey I tried to identify and what the students sort of listed as their issues. They just talk about that the students are not coping well, but they're surmising that those are the causative effects, and I really question whether that's really accurate.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm just making a rationalization off the top of my head, I would just kind of understand. You think about terrorism and you just think about just the hopelessness because it just continues to be prevalent. It just seems as though that I guess that would be the natural reaction. Instead of having a terrorist try to take my life or harm it, I guess I would just take my own. Am I kind of...
Well, and again, some of these are background issues. You think about climate change, too. If you've been going through all the schools and say, this is, we're going to have a major economic collapse, we're going to have a major ecological collapse, we're going to have a major terrorist attack, those may not be front and center, but they're kind of just background noise. And then you add to it, I'm being bullied on my social media right now, or I just lost a girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, or I did poorly in school. You can see how that could set you off, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. So when we come back, we're going to have to take one of the commercial break, but we're going to be taking your phone calls as well. Greg will be online. Dr. Knopf will be online and be taking your phone calls as well, so you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212, or you can go over to the Facebook page, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. And when you can go over to the Facebook page, you can like it, and then you can leave your comment or your question in the live media box that we've got going right now, and we'll be sure to get to that during our time together. If you want to find out more information on Dr. Knopf, you can go to the Point of View website, pointofview.net as well, to find out more information. And we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when President Trump set forth his national security strategy, he omitted global climate change as a threat. 2 years earlier, President Obama elevated climate change as a top strategic risk in his strategy. The ongoing debate about the significance of climate change will continue for years to come. I contend that the debate is really about percentages. Consider people who often are labeled climate change deniers. Even these people believe the climate changed in the past. We've had an ice age and a medieval warming period. They just don't believe that human activity is the major driver for climate change. But they will usually admit that some small percentage of human activity might be influential. On the other side are people who are deeply concerned about climate change, but I doubt any of them believe that human activity is responsible for 100% of the change in the climate. We've had variations in the climate long before the Industrial Revolution, so really the debate is between percentages. Some believe the percentage is low, others believe it is higher. Sometimes the discussion is framed as a debate between those who believe in science, that is climate change, and others who are anti-science, the deniers. But consider this recent quote from geologist Ian Plimer, who believes in evolution and is anything but an anti-science proponent. He says climate change has taken place for thousands of millions of years. Climate change occurred before humans evolved on Earth. He says he cannot find any correlation between temperature change and human emissions of carbon dioxide. Therefore, he concludes that without correlation, there is no causation. Perhaps it is time to cool some of the rhetoric and consider what we know and don't know about climate change. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back on Point of View on this Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018 day. My name is Nick Pitts, and I'm leading up this Millennial Roundtable, and we've got Kerby Anderson as well as Chelsey Youman. And we also had Greg Knopf on the line. Dr. Knopf is really just bringing in some great insights relative to depression and suicide, and was talking about recently about the uptick in the suicide rate that's just been happening, and really identified three particular characteristics that really would kind of define this. And you said, Dr. Knopf, you said, one, there was the terrorism component, two, cell phones, and then three, social media component. So can you share more about that cell phones? Because I'm thinking about some research out of Jean Twenge. She's really out of San Diego State University, has really been showing that cell phones really are inhibiting happiness the more time you're looking at the screen, it seems like.
Yes. Well, I'm not an expert on cell phone use. I'm quoting some of these statistics that are showing it. It appears to be, and of course they also add in the increased economic insecurity, and I think this idea of people being frightened about world events, and but it appears that there's a correlation. If the kids are having, up to 5 hours a day of cell phone use, that their rate of suicide ideation and intentions, dramatically go up. Because again, there's this, I believe that God has created us for a relationship, and what you're having is sort of a false idea of what relationships involve, and you don't have that personal connection one-on-one. It's just these short sound bites and short texts and things like that and then people are left to sort of make their own conclusions. So whether or not that's, I think it has a factor, whether or not it's the major factor. I think maybe people have this idea that, depression is only a recent problem in our society, that no people in the past have experienced that. But that's not true. And if you read through the Psalms, I can share a couple Psalms with you, which is amazing. It's so relevant to what's going on in our life and our world today.
Yeah, I think that you bring up an excellent point. I mean, suicide might not be prevalent in the Bible, but I mean, just a cursory reading through the Psalms, and you can see many symptoms of depression as well as suicide that are littered all throughout the Psalms. Absolutely. It's very clear. In fact, if you don't mind, I'll just share one with you, which I think is at the top of the list. You could read this from USA Today. It says, I found myself in trouble and went looking for my Lord. My life was an open wound that wouldn't heal. My friends said, everything will turn out all right. But I didn't believe a word they said. I remember God and shake my head. I bow my head and then wring my hands. I'm awake all night, not a wink of sleep. I can't even say what's bothering me. I go over the days one by one and ponder the years gone by. I strum my guitar all through the night, wondering how to get my life together. Will the Lord walk off and leave me for good? Will he never smile again? Has God forgotten his manners? Has he angrily stalked off and left me? Just my luck, I said. The high God goes out of business just the moment I need him. Boy, it sounds very, very intense. But verse 1 of that chapter, which happens in the Hebrew scriptures, gives you the conclusion. And it says, I yell out to my God. I yell with all my might. I yell at the top of my lungs. He listens. And that word listens is not just, oh, yeah, I'll put you in my queue and I'll get back to you when I get around to it. It's like when he says he listens, it's I'm actively involved in coming to your rescue. I'm going to put places and people in position that will come and make a difference in your life, and you will see my hand in your life. But it is actually predicated on our honesty. And if we come to God and say, hey, everything's going okay, and the Lord will say, okay, well, if that's where you're at, that's fine. But when we're ready to come to him and pour out our hearts and say, Lord, I'm struggling, and I need your help, that is when I believe that God really shows up. And so we're never closer to God than when we recognize our need for him. And I believe that is also what's going on in the deeper aspects of our culture, is that people don't have a sense of their need for God, and yet they're trying to find out, I feel so threatened and with all the events of the world and all the things that are happening, and I have nowhere to turn. And I think that, we know who the author of life is. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, the idea of being able to express your feelings towards God and recognize that your God's big enough for your problems because he can handle the truth, because he is the truth. And I think that's one of the illuminating things. I mean, Kerby brought up 13 Reasons Why, which seems to be enabling a type of behavior and options that the Bible and what we would just consider as Christians to not be a viable option of suicide. But then you see, even on Broadway, with the Dear Evan Hansen, I don't know if you're familiar with that particular play, it really does center in on bullying and an individual that ended up committing suicide in that. But probably one of the more famous songs from that play is the song You Will Be Found, the recognition that it feels like he's lost in the midst of his difficulties and minutiae of life. That's the recognition that he will be found. And that's very true of the Christian perspective, right? Absolutely.
Greg, let me for just a minute. I'm thinking some people are saying, well, I'm trying to figure out if my son or daughter's depressed. Maybe I'm trying to figure out if I'm depressed. I've run into a lot of people say, I didn't even realize I was depressed until years later. One of the things we've made available on your website before, depressionoutreach.com, and it's at our website, pointofview.net, is a ebook on 9 lies about depression. But can you give us a sense of what to look for? Because if indeed we are facing this sort of post-holiday depression, or if indeed we are worried about some of the things that our children or grandchildren are seeing on their cell phones and social media. What should we be looking for?
Yes, well, that's exactly right, Kerby, because oftentimes people don't recognize what they're experiencing, and they don't know whether or not they're moving from a normal emotion of depression or sadness or things which is a temporary thing to more of a medical and more of a biological problem that becomes more entrenched. And the major symptoms that people need to look for are things like trouble with sleep. Oftentimes not trouble getting to sleep, but oftentimes trouble staying asleep. And another one is loss of interest. You know, I just don't want to go to the movie with my friends. I don't want to read the scripture. I just want to sort of chill out. I just want to sort of, isolate myself. Another one is inappropriate guilt, and it oftentimes is not related to something that you've done. It's just sort of a sense of, you know what, I just don't deserve God's love, and there's something must be wrong with me. And then another one, which is huge, is just lack of energy and fatigue. And about 60% of people who come to my office complaining of fatigue, I'll check them for low thyroid and anemia and all the medical conditions, but 60% of the time it will be because they're experiencing actually biochemical depression, which is the cause of their fatigue. And oftentimes there's a lack of concentration and focus and motivation. Some people, when they get depressed, they also have anxiety and agitation. There's a sort of a lot of crossover with being anxious and worried, as well as being exhausted and feeling down and hopeless. And there's also sometimes physical complaints. You've heard a lot about fibromyalgia. There's one of the specialists and experts in the area who believes that fibromyalgia is simply depression without the mood component. And in fact, one of the best treatments for fibromyalgia is medications that adjust the neurotransmitters in your spine and in your cerebral spinal fluid that's actually in the category of antidepressants. And then oftentimes just thoughts of suicide begin to sort of say, I'm just wondering what if, and those things can be important. And so one of the things we stress in some of the seminars we do and things like that is that feeling depressed is not the problem. It's a signal that you might have a problem. And you need to think of it in that way, that it's not just a diagnosis, because some people want to jump to the conclusions. Well, if you're depressed, it means that you've sinned or you're demon-possessed or, it's your own fault, and maybe your parents messed up when they, tried to help you when you were a young person. So there's lots of misconceptions as to the causes of depression, but once these symptoms, are there for more than a couple of weeks and persisting, then it's really important to begin to have an evaluation. And that can be done sometimes with self-assessment questionnaires, and see a physician, maybe a counselor, maybe a pastor, that someone can at least steer you in the right direction to sort of say, these are some things that would be helpful to begin to address the underlying cause, because unless you find the underlying cause, just throwing medication at something is not going to be helpful.
That's good. Well, we will be back right after this, and we'll be taking your phone calls as well, so be sure to call in or leave a message on the Facebook page. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, and I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Chelsey Youman and Kerby Anderson. And we've got on the line right now Dr. Greg Knopf, who has been talking to us about depression and suicide, and was just bringing up some really great comments relative and just some great insights relative to depression and depression being a symptom. And it's just really fascinating. So we're going to start taking some phone calls, but we got Chelsey also has a question as well.
Oh, well, I was just going to make more of a comment than anything that I don't think this is isolated to Oregon. I think in Texas we're having issues too. My mom is a counselor in a local school district here, and I know that they've had almost a dozen successful suicides, not to mention attempts, and that's not an isolated issue, that it's really rampant. And she's been a counselor now since I can remember, 25, 30 years now, and the climate that our schools are in is just so unlike anything she's seen before that I have to think, when I hear Dr. Knopf, your reasoning for some of this is preventable. Cell phones, for one. I would think limiting cell phone access to these children, helping give them coping skills for the issues that they're going to endure. You know, some of those things might be more preventative on the front end.
I agree with you, Chelsey, and I know that what we're talking about here, even though I'm reading from the local paper from Oregon, but this is nationwide, and it's also worldwide. We now know that probably within 5 to 10 years, that depression will be the leading cause of morbidity and health-related issues worldwide, surpassing heart disease. So this is not just something that's isolated in one area of the country, and it's something that is important to deal with. And the great thing is that we have resources and the potential to offer people real hope and real transformation. I'm so glad that your mom is a counselor. I have the friend that I've written the books with, and I love to send patients to him. Although it's bad for business, because when I do, they do so well. Then I see them back. They've just their countenance is totally different, and the Lord has met them, and they've experienced healing, and it truly is a transformational thing in their lives.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really great point, Dr. Knopf, in the sense that it is a worldwide problem. I'm reminded yesterday, you can go onto the Point of View website and find this article about the news about a YouTube star, Logan Paul, used his influence to be able to video what's known as a suicide forest and showed a dead body. And there was such a huge backlash to that. But Chelsey, you were talking during the break, your kind of experience in the Asian culture and how increasingly there's that isolation component, and there's the depression, and then unfortunate there's the suicide option that's becoming all too often relevant.
Right. My husband and I went on a mission trip, a short-term mission trip to Japan a few years ago, and we did a lot of studying because the culture really is truly so different than our culture here in America. And it is one of the most unreached populations in the world. It's less than 0.01% of the population is Christian. And if you think of how large their population truly is, that's really astounding. But it's been an open country for a very long time, since even before China was an open country. And so there are just some natural cultural barriers there to Christianity and the gospel taking root. But part of the symptoms of that is a very, very high suicide rate. And I know that students commit suicide at an outstanding rate there because their whole lives are under a pressure cooker. They take a test in the 8th grade that determines their entire career path in the 8th grade. They have a specific day in August that's designated as a suicide watch day for back to school. They have a suicide forest. I mean, it is truly really a problematic issue there.
You're exactly right, and I think that there's a tendency oftentimes in shame-based cultures is to pretend that everything is fine. And we're going to sort of, now you have this idea that, oh yes, I'm just doing fine, everything's well, and I'm just going to sort of play the game and play the role. And then internally you have this conflict and recognize that you're living a lie. And this is not really how you feel, but this is how you're expected to act. And that creates all sorts of internal distress that then is going to affect your whole physical body and your brain neurotransmitters and everything about you because of the ongoing anxiety to try to keep up the front and keep up the facade.
Wow. We're going to continue to take some phone calls, and we'll jump over to Georgia right now. We've got Rebecca on the line. Rebecca, are you there? You there, Rebecca? Rebecca? Okay, we'll hold Rebecca, and we'll jump over to Raymond in California. Raymond, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, Raymond, we can hear you. What's your point of view or your question?
Yes, actually, with the suicide rate going up, do you see more opportunities for them to also get help going up as well?
Raymond, I would sure like to think that's the case, and I think that a couple things are occurring. Obviously, in the state of Oregon, is trying to be addressed from a public health standpoint. You have suicide hotlines, those kind of things to help. And, that's a good thing, and I applaud those. And at the same time, what is happening with in our schools is something that I don't have direct involvement currently. And maybe one of the things, to be honest, is that I think that as churches in the country, some churches are actually want to avoid this subject. And they say, you know what, if we start talking about it, we'll be inundated with people who need help, and we don't have the capacity to help them. Therefore, we're going to say we're going to limit our, discussions and what we're going to do to certain areas that are safer and not as controversial. And I think that we lose the opportunity to come alongside others. And in fact, I'd love to just read this. This means so much to me, this scriptural passage. And it's from 2 Corinthians, and it says, "All praise to the God and Father of our Master Jesus Messiah, Father of all mercy, God of all healing counsel. He comes alongside us when we go through hard times, and before you know it, he brings us alongside someone else who is going through hard times so that we can be there for that person just as God was there for us. And we have plenty of hard times that come from following the Messiah, but no more than the good times of his healing comfort. And we are given the privilege of sharing sacred space with people and just to come alongside and say, you know what, I'm just sensing you might be hurting right now. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're going through? And I want to sort of just, express my concern and care for you. And just those kind of comments as we come into contact with people who are hurting can open the door for I think it's going to need to come from people who recognize that they can make a difference in other people's lives. And you don't have to be a medical professional to be a compassionate person and to come alongside someone and help them and allow God to use you in their lives. And it's an extraordinarily wonderful privilege that we have, I believe.
That's phenomenal. I'm even reminded of what some individuals are, how they're utilizing their influence. Like you were talking about, that personal ability that each of us has to be able to be that helping hand to an individual, to be the Spirit of God to them, and really be one that draws close to the brokenhearted. I'm reminded of a particular rapper, Logic, and so we normally won't mention in an advantageous way rappers on the program, but we'll make an exception to this because there was a fascinating song that he released last year, and the title of the song is 1-800-273-8255, which for those that have ears to hear, that's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. That even this rapper Logic in this song is taken off. It's like one of the top. It broke the Billboard. It broke into the Billboard Top 100. This song became so prevalent and popular that even this rapper is using his influence to be able to help those individuals.
That's a great thing.
And I think it's just an illustration, again, of all the resources that are available. Greg, just before we take a break, I thought we might mention that you do have a way in which people can get some resources and material. And I know one of them, if I remember right, is free. So it's an opportunity for somebody to get an ebook download, right?
Yes, and on our website we have this ebook. and it's called, 9 lies that people don't realize that it hurts everyone, not only the people who are hurting, but those people in their family and in their context, and these misconceptions that people have. And and then we also, on the website, I have 4 self-assessment questionnaires, which allows people to begin in their privacy of their own home to look at some of the symptoms they're having, and it helps to quantify them. And one of them is a Hamilton Depression Scale, which allows you to sort of answer some questions, and it helps to sort of quantify whether you could be depressed. Another one that rates your level of anxiety. Another one that rates your level.
Greg, we'll be back right after this. We'll come back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Ben Franklin reportedly said, "There is nothing certain in life except for death and taxes." Well, in a 548-page complaint, one man has targeted at least one of those certainties, and it's not death. Terry Lee Hines contends that the United States tax code has violated the Constitution by establishing taxism and institutionalized faith and religion. Because the tax code has the effect of favoring and even promoting organized religions through tax breaks and other benefits, Mr. Hines believes the tax code is in violation of the First Amendment. Well, I suppose this is the sort of case that law students are forced to grapple with, but actually have little effect in the real world. Some may dream such a lawsuit is the silver bullet to bring down our ghoulish tax system. Alas, Mr. Hines' lawsuit will not free us from the taxman's visit every April 15. For one reason, taxpayers have a lot of hurdles to overcome just to bring the lawsuit. Mere allegations, even ones dressed up in the garb of a First Amendment challenge, that they do not like to pay taxes will not be sufficient. For now, Mr. Hines and the rest of us will have to continue to pay our taxes, and most importantly, the religious charities and houses of worship that are exempt from them will continue to be exempt. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View for this last segment on this Millennial Roundtable, January 3rd, 2018. I'm Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable in studio by Kerby Anderson and Chelsey Youman of the First Liberty Institute. And then we've got Dr. Greg Knopf joining us from Oregon. And then he's been talking about depression. And right before we went to break, he was sharing some resources and information for us, for listeners specifically, that they might be able to access, if you wouldn't mind continuing.
Sure, yeah. At the website, I also have a wonderful brain animation that people can see how the neurotransmitters work, because it's rather complicated and it's not explained very well by most physicians, but it's kind of just a 3-minute animation that explains how the brain chemicals communicate with one another and where certain medications work and why antidepressants are not addictive. And then also we have these resources there, and one is to help people have an assessment for possible depression, another one for anxiety disorders, another one for possible bipolar, which is oftentimes seen in certain families, and another one for attention and hyperactivity disorders. And so people can access those free and fill those out and then take them to their physician and to discuss and say, you know, is this something that could be possibly going on with me? And so that would be a free resource that's available there on the website.
You know, Greg, one of the things I might just mention is that Hamilton survey, which you have available, is very simple for people to fill out, and it has 25 questions. And first of all, it's good for a self-assessment, but, you know, we have a lot of listeners right now. They may be in a church setting. They may be a pastor. They may be an elder, a deacon, a church leader, and they might have somebody in their care who they are a little concerned about. They could hand this 2-page survey and say, why don't you fill this out and just see how you do, because it's not intimidating to the individual. They're doing a self-assessment. But at the end, if instead they're getting numbers over the over 40, and won't go into all the meaning of all of the numbers, they're going to say, you know, I really do have a problem. And I've run into people over the years, and I know you have as a doctor, of people that for 10 years said, I didn't know what was wrong with me. And finally I did an assessment, or I had somebody actually do some evaluation, and I was actually struggling with depression, and I didn't even know I was depressed. This is one way in which you can have another resource so that you can be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ and make a difference in the lives of people around you.
Well, I'm so glad you get it, Kerby, because it's exactly right. Because one of the 9 lies about depression that hurt everyone is that one of the lies is that if you get depressed, you'll know it. And that's not true. Oftentimes people can struggle with these symptoms for years and think that's normal for them. I literally I remember several years ago, one gentleman, he came in and I saw him. I said, you know what, with your family history and what's going on and things like that, I said, let's try this for you. And then he came in to me and he literally said, it's like the clouds parted and the sun came out, and I didn't know what it was like to feel normal. So that's not everybody that has that reaction, but it's enough that you go, wow, this is something that it's a real thing, and that people can experience real healing and help depending upon what are the causes and what are the issues going on that contribute to the experiences of depression that they're having.
Yeah. Okay, so if I'm a listener right now, or I am a listener, because I'm very inquisitive with this, because I think there's going to be a line in which, yes, we want to be the hands and feet to those that are hurting, but then there comes a point in the symptoms, and there comes a point in their status where it's outside. We would say it's above our pay grade. Right. What would be those characteristics that these listeners should look for when it's above their pay grade, it's above their head? Where do they need to start directing individuals towards the professionals?
Yes, and I think that hopefully there's like the American Council of Christian Psychologists is one organization that has members all across the country, and there are your local physicians, and hopefully if you talk to your pastor or staff person in your church, that they know of capable people in the community who can offer compassionate care and can help assess what's going on. So I think you don't have to, by entering into a person's pain, you don't have to be the source of their healing. You just have to sort of say, I want to be with you in this process. And I'm going to be here for you and to encourage you and to help give you resources and to find the help that you need. And that way you can come alongside them. And I believe that the Lord will direct your paths, and that the Lord will say, okay, this person will come in, or this person called, or this person came to mind, and I'm just going to call them up and ask them and say, do you know of anybody who could help in this way? Well, yes, I know it's somebody. And then you can direct someone and point them in the right direction, which would be amazing.
That's phenomenal. So let's take one more phone call. We'll go back to Rebecca in Georgia. Rebecca, are you there?
I'm there. I'm here.
Hey, it's good to have you back. What is your point of view, Rebecca?
I teach at a university in South Georgia, and I see students walking all over campus and passing one another and having their cell phone out. You can tell they're texting with the headphones and that's like a cap usually, and the head down. And it's just everywhere, and where I used to see us saying hello and smiling at one another as we walked along. And so it's a very big difference for South Georgia, the environment that I'm seeing. And then when the students come in the classroom, and it might be a larger class, but as students come in, they are in the same mode. They're just sitting down. They don't look at one another. They don't talk to one another. And they just seem so isolated and unable to cope with anything where it requires them to talk to one another. I do a little activity, at the beginning, trying to get them to warm up a little, and it involves them having to interact with other students. And it's very interesting to watch because there are people that do just fine, but there are awkward groups that you can pick out. And another thing about the students is that they are so anxious. They are just overly anxious. I've been teaching 13 years, and before that I worked for almost 30 out in the community in my profession, and the students have changed so much. It's just constantly wanting to know where they stand and how is their grade, and oh my, how are they going to juggle everything?
Yeah, Rebecca, you bring up some really great points. I think, Greg, I'd be really interested to hear your comments relative to cell phone usage. Is there a way that maybe some helpful tips to be able to limit them?
Yeah, there are some schools now who are sort of, this is a cell-free zone kind of stuff, and while you're here, you have to put your cell phones away, and they are recognizing that this is definitely a problem. It's interesting that she brought up the anxiousness of the students who are so isolated, and I have a quote from another study that says, an epidemic of anxiety and depression is affecting American college students. In 1985, 18% of incoming college freshmen said they, quote, felt overwhelmed by all that I had to do, end quote, the previous year. By last year, that number had surged to 41%. Hospital admissions for hospital admissions for suicidal teenagers have doubled over the past 10 years. And that's just some of the statistics that are out there from legitimate sources. And I think this isolation that, like I say, everybody's in the room, nobody's saying anything, nobody's relating, they're all, looking at their screens and have their earbuds in. It really is an interesting phenomenon, and what can we do to sort of break that down and just sort of say, we need to be, God has created us as relational beings, and how can we relate to one another, reach out to one another, and I think it can be transformative.
That's phenomenal. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. And for those that are watching on Facebook right now, you can find his information in the comment box. Or if you want to hop on over to pointofview.net, you can find more information about Greg as well as about First Liberty Institute and the Daily Briefing as well. And so thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team. But we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because